At the end of the day, it's not about what you have or even what you've accomplished. It's about what you've done with those accomplishments. It's about who you've lifted up, who you've made better. It's about what you've given back. Denzel Washington. Welcome to Inspire Vision. Our sole purpose is to elevate the lives of others and to inspire you to do the same.
Hey, folks, thanks for joining us today. This is Dr. Doug with Dr. Doug and Friends Radio. It's interesting probably 2 months ago, I had an opportunity to interview some folks about a very, very serious situation that's going on in our country pre-COVID pandemic. And it's the anxiety disorders and OCD that's occurring in our children and in our teens. And after that interview, I was suggested that I get a hold of an extremely leading authority on this. And so I managed to get a hold of her, and I am really pleased to have Dr. Lauren Wadsworth on the phone with us today. Lauren, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. It started to snow up here in Western New York, so that's always fun. In quotes.
That's no good. Yeah, we had snow last week, and then it's all gone. We've been in the mid 50s for the last week,
Ooh,
so that's great.
nice.
And it's coming back down again. So anyway, it's really interesting. You have quite an amazing background. Would you share with the audience a little bit about your background academically and so forth, and what you're doing and how you got to this point?
Sure. So I would say it really all started when I was in undergrad at Smith College and took an advanced seminar with Dr. Randy Frost, who is the world leading expert on OCD and compulsive hoarding specifically. And I was just totally amazed by what he described as compulsive hoarding behavior and asked if I could coach people that were trying to declutter their homes as a first clinical experience. And he said yes, which turned into developing a treatment program where I would train undergrads to help people for free, doing CBT, so cognitive behavioral therapy, informed exposures to move through the anxiety that decluttering was bringing up to bring their homes back to a state that was more livable. So that program really kicked off my interest in OCD and anxiety and exposure-based treatments specifically. I did a couple stints in labs between that point in graduate school, working in Alzheimer's research and a bunch of other neurological conditions, and then ended up attending graduate school at the University of Massachusetts in Boston in the clinical psych program, doing my PhD on basically anxiety disorders, both clinically and research. So I would say the highlight of my clinical training was my years at McLean Hospital. So for those that are unfamiliar, McLean is often seen as the last stop for a lot of people that have tried treatment, oftentimes all over the world. And it's considered one of the leading, if not the leading, psychiatric institutes. So at McLean, I had the opportunity to work in a partial hospital program, basically helping people develop skills in a 2-week intensive after being inpatient. And most notably, spent some time at the Ocd Institute, which is probably my favorite academic home on earth, and is a residential and partial hospital program where folks can go for about 3 months and do exposure therapy all day, every day, in addition to group therapy and individual therapy to decrease their OCD symptoms. And then after that, I moved back home to Western New York to start my dream clinic, treating OCD and severe anxiety. And really the main goal was bringing evidence-based treatments to this region that there haven't been many here before this clinic because of it being really rural and there not being a lot of access to evidence-based care. So currently, I run Genesee Valley Psychology, and we have 3 main tracks: OCD, trauma, and dialectical behavior therapy, which treats borderline personality disorder and emotion dysregulation. So that's the summary.
Well, and you talk about very specific evidence-based theories, and you said that at this point in time it hadn't been there. And I'm just curious, as we talk about that compared to other treatment modalities that are going on in general, maybe not necessarily by clinical people. Do you find that there's definitely a difference in the overall result from the evidence base versus what else is going on?
Yeah, I think it really depends on what the person's coming in with. If it's something like OCD, then it is so common for people to come to our clinic and say, I've been in weekly therapy for 7 years and I've never gotten better. And in fact, my symptoms have just gotten worse. And that's because talk therapy or supportive therapy, where someone comes in, talks about their week, and the therapist is supportive and encouraging, doesn't actually address the problem when it comes to OCD. And that's often the case with other disorders as well. Some things like general stress or relationship issues, or in some cases trauma, can really be helped by that more general supportive therapy. But there are some things that you really need that evidence-based treatment. And if you don't, you're treading water or in some cases getting worse.
Okay, well, that's good to know. I appreciate you clarifying that. And believe me, I actually have people that I know that keep going through that talk therapy, and I don't see any results. So I'm glad you
Yeah.
clarified that. So we were actually going to go on a number of weeks ago, and then you shared with me that you were going to this specific conference called the Space Program that you felt would be worth talking about, and so we kind of postponed it till now. So could you share with the audience a little bit about the space program and what you learned about that? Because I think one of the biggest challenges that I'm aware of, well, and in fact, a lot of time parents are not aware of, because with teens, with children who are developing this anxiety, as I said, it seems to be really a bad situation right now, that oftentimes I think we as parents, and I have to accept personal responsibility myself as a parent, may inadvertently be somewhat of a cause of that. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about the space program, and then we can get into some of this other stuff.
Sure. I think it might be helpful to talk just more generally first about the development of anxiety and then the way that families play a role, and then how the space program is really unique, if that would be okay to kind of provide a little background.
Great, that's good. Go ahead.
Sure. So anxiety is pretty common in kids and teens. Like you said, I agree. It's a bit of a pandemic right now. I think one factor is this swing to really letting kids share their emotions and share what their limits and share what their boundaries are. We've become more accepting of that as a culture, talking about mood and anxiety. I think as a result, parents and families have understandably jumped to, okay, how can I, help you not feel that way? And the two of those things together, I think, have kind of created a perfect storm where kids are saying, I'm anxious, and a parent is saying, that's bad. Okay, how do we stop that? And then trying to remove whatever the stimulus was for that anxiety. So if that's, for example, the kid saying, I feel really sick this morning, I don't think I can go to school, and the parent says, okay, let me just take care of you, then all of a sudden there's this big reward for being sick, for having a stomach ache. Maybe it's now 3 days in and the kid's still not feeling better, but now they've missed school and they have all these homework assignments built up and it seems insurmountable. And then just the idea of going to school and facing the consequences or not being prepared becomes anxiety provoking. And then parents might help by doing the homework. So those behaviors, it's like this subtle invisible dance where what could have been a small amount of anxiety in the first place grows to all available space. And every time the parents take away a stressor, the anxiety grows to that space. So it's not as simple as, okay, let me just help you with your homework this one time. It's that is setting up a dynamic in a relationship between the parent and the anxiety that becomes hurtful. So I think, while it's really great that we talk more about mood, this idea of okay, then anxiety is bad and we should change it right away is, again, a very natural response. And I understand why we all do it. Evolutionarily, I could go into that for forever. It does kind of create this it perpetuates this idea that anxiety is something we have to change. And so parents get stuck. The SPACE program is really unique and special because oftentimes parents will come to the clinic and say, my kid has anxiety. Can you fix it? And they might, like you're saying, have a sense of, I don't know if I should be doing something differently, but really like my kid needs to be in therapy because they're anxious and they can't go to school. And so we might try to start with the kid. Maybe the kid's not interested. Maybe the kid would rather be on their phone than talking to a therapist. Maybe they like that they get to stay home and watch Netflix all day. So why would they want to change anything? Maybe the kid has autism and they don't really understand what the whole problem is here. And so what the SPACE program does, it was designed by the Yale Child Study Center. They basically studied, or they asked the question of, what if we didn't involve the kid in therapy at all? What if we just treated the parents? Would it be as effective? And they found out that, in fact, it was equally effective as doing cognitive behavioral therapy with kids. So the SPACE program has two main targets. The first one is helping parents develop more supportive statements to their kids that are validating of the anxiety, but not treating anxiety like it's bad or dangerous. So that might be something like, I can see that you're really struggling. I can see that you're really anxious about this homework assignment, and I know you can do it. So it's validating the suffering, but also being supportive about, I know you can handle it, or we can handle this together. And then the second part is helping the parents figure out the ways that they are accommodating the kid and their anxiety, maybe by helping out with homework or letting them skip school or talking for them in a social situation, and helping the parent make a list of all those behaviors, describe to the kid why they're going to stop doing those behaviors, and then resist those behaviors going forward. So there isn't that constant expansion of anxiety by parents removing stressors.
Well, and that's a tough one, because as a parent, if you see your child experiencing anxiety at any level, you want to help. You want to help. And yet, from what you're saying, in some cases, what we're doing actually, rather than helping, is hindering and contributing maybe a little bit more to the anxiety. So here's the question, Lauren. What on earth is happening in our society that we are seeing such a huge amount of anxiety, not only in our young children, but also in our teenagers, our early 20 year olds and so forth? What do you think has been causing this? What is it that has happened in society to cause this, in your opinion?
Yeah, so when you ask that question, that's a huge question. But what my brain tries to do is, okay, let's come back to the theory. Let's come back to the bird's eye view. We know that when we treat anxiety, we ask people to do the things that scare them. So if it's OCD about germs, then we ask them to touch the doorknob. If it's social anxiety, we ask them to say a joke in public, or ask someone on a date, or give a talk at your school. So we know that approaching anxiety helps diminish, decrease, or even cure anxiety. So there must be some opposite thing happening in society if anxiety is getting worse. So then I would ask, what are the ways that kids these days are able to avoid or escape or never approach anxiety-provoking things? So some examples that come to mind are that now that video games are a thing, that cuts out a lot of time where kids might be having to feel boredom and then push through that and then think of something creative to do instead, or feel sadness and draw or journal, or feel anger and address it or work through it, as opposed to feeling any ounce of emotion or boredom and then just jumping right into video games. So I think video games and media, YouTube, social media, same thing. There are these quick ways to distract from how we're feeling. So then we lose that opportunity to approach the anxiety or the frustration or the sadness, feel it, realize it's not a bad thing to feel, and then it does pass on its own. I think other examples are having social media and phones has enabled kids to avoid in-person interactions and having to work through awkward silences, having to come up with questions on the spot. Instead, they have endless amounts of time to think about and craft their response. And in some ways, that becomes a whole trap because it can take longer and longer the more you're trying to perfect it, which we can get into. But those are a few things that come to mind. Video games and computers serving to avoid emotional distress, social media avoiding in-person social interactions. And I think that just in general, becoming less community focused and less community in-person interactions has been making everyone feel a bit more isolated, depressed, and anxious. And we've seen that heighten throughout COVID. So COVID has sort of been this like catalyzing microscope on all of those processes that we've been seeing over time as people have become more often on their computers and less in person with each other.
Well, and that makes it really interesting because as these young people are, you know, many times now online school, and they finish around 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, and then what are they going to do? And they end up,
Mm-hmm.
because they end up playing video games or going on social media and all of that type
Yeah.
of thing. So what do you recommend to parents of these children as far as how do they help these kids, particularly during COVID times, to actually avoid getting into that situation of anxiety or OCD or just in general stress?
Yeah, I think there are 1,000 things, luckily. The first thing that comes to mind is, I think, one of the most important, which is creating a norm and modeling the behavior of noticing your emotions, checking in on them, and then regulating those emotions in front of your kids. So, say you come home from work, you might say, "Ooh, I had a long day. I'm feeling pretty anxious about a meeting I have tomorrow. So, I'm going to really try to put my phone aside and focus on this dinner together because I know that being mindful and connecting with people that I love will help me feel better and won't feed into that anxiety spiral. Because I could just sit here and be like, what's going to happen in that meeting? What's going to happen? And then watch Netflix. But I know that that's just pushing it off. So I think showing your kids that you also have emotions, that you're also going through a pandemic, and then modeling the behaviors that you would like them to do is key. So I think oftentimes parents will say, oh, my kid's on video games all day. And then when you ask what they do when they come home, it's go home, make dinner, eat it in front of the television, and then binge watch Netflix the rest of the night. So really trying to make sure that we're practicing what we're preaching. Setting limits can be really helpful. So if a kid is struggling with pretty severe anxiety, we would always have a behavioral plan, which means that we have sort of mapped out what does the kid do when they're feeling bad, or what are their go-to activities that they can approach no matter how bad they're feeling. That might be video games or TV. And then what are some things that they do when they're feeling really good, or they want to do more of, or you're hoping they'll do more of. That might be hanging out with friends, doing the homework, having dinner with the family, and then trying to use those together to increase desired behaviors and decrease the undesirable behaviors. So if a kid is really suffering with not being able to get to school, then we might say, you can't play a video game until you've gone to school for a whole day. And if you go for a whole day, you earn an hour and a half. And if you go 2 days in a row, that evening you get 2 hours, so on and so forth. So being really thoughtful about how can we use the things that they're really motivated to do to help them do the things that they're not so motivated to do, but that we know will help them feel less anxious.
So interestingly, with the COVID right now, like for instance here in Utah, we are literally shut down to stay within the household at this point in time because just such a
Wow.
massive weight. And And so as some of these kids come, and finish their high school classes online, and suddenly they're alone. And particularly if their personalities are such that they tend to be outgoing personalities and they love to be with friends and so forth, and they can't. So my
Hmm.
question is just like what you and I are doing right now. What does it help for them to actually get a hold of their friends, whether it's on Zoom or some way that they can actually talk in person to their friends?
Absolutely. And there are a lot of ways that technology has aimed to meet the kids and teens where they're at, which I really appreciate. So, for example, there's an app called House Party where it looks like FaceTime. So you go into the app and it's you see your face and then your friends can pop in. You can either invite them to a house party or you can say, "Hey, I'm in house party. Everyone come that wants to." So you can kind of host a party, or just have a one-on-one. And that app, you can talk to a person, but also play games while you're doing it, or do like a Jeopardy kind of quiz that's sort of overlaid on your faces, so that if someone is nervous about socializing, but as for everyone, it would be helpful for them to do so. There's sort of this crutch of this in between of like, okay, let's talk, but we're also playing a game. There's something else to focus on in addition to connecting with my friend. There's also a way, I think it's called Netflix House Party, although I might just be mixing up the names, where you can watch the same Netflix show with your friend and communicate through it. So it's sort of like you're having a movie night, but you're in your own houses. So I think that's one thing that I've been so grateful about with COVID's timing is that we do have all of these technologies that allow us to communicate. And I think I'm hearing a lot of teens spending a lot of time on FaceTime right now, talking to their friends, sharing TikTok videos, pretty much online all the time. But I think you're right. There's a really important piece of going above just commenting on each other's things or sending messages and making sure that the kid is at least trying to connect with someone on video chat.
So have we created this situation? I mean, you mentioned a little bit about parenting and about how we just kind of give in and want to help our kids. As we look at the the millenniums, and as we look at others, younger generation, where there seems to be an expectation of being given things without work. Have we, as older generations and as parents and so forth, literally wanted to give our children so much that we've literally caused this issue of not having them learn responsibility and thus develop anxiety and OCD?
Yeah, I think it's possible. I mean, just to say, I think probably 5 to 7% of kids would have had anxiety and OCD, even if it was the opposite. But I do think that we're seeing it play a bigger role now than before. I would say that neither are ideal. So where we're at now isn't ideal, where we're kind of following our evolved mechanisms of, ooh, you feel anxious, let me help you not feel that way. That's not ideal. But neither was the 1940s, 1950s, like suck it up, don't be a wuss, whatever those messages were. Don't talk about sadness or anxiety. So my thought is that parents now are sort of reacting to that older ideology that was not helpful and was in fact pretty harmful, and swung the pendulum all the way over here. And now we're saying, whoa, that's a little bit too far. So how do we get in the middle? I think the space program really perfectly describes what the middle would be. It would be, it's okay to say you're anxious. We validate that anxiety. Yeah, that makes sense that you're scared. You've never given a talk before. Of course you're nervous. And it empowers the kid to say, I know you can do it. And there's this added piece that I think hopefully we get to next, which is approaching things that scare you is extremely empowering and helps you grow as a person. So I think that's what the middle ground looks like. And I think that required the pendulum swinging all the way here. So did we cause it? Yes. Is it terrible? No. Can we come back to the middle? Yeah. And I think we're doing so pretty quickly.
So as you chat, there's I get a sense that there's certain different levels of anxiety, of the anxiety disorder. I mean, there's those that are just, oh, I don't want to go to school. I'm a little nervous. I'm anxious about that, all the way to deep, deep anxiety. How do you treat those differently? And could you kind of identify those different levels?
Sure. So I guess I would first say that nobody has zero anxiety. So I'd say level one is the ideal, where we still have that internal evolved mechanism to fear things that are dangerous. Like, I would not want you, Dr. Doug, to walk across the street and see a bus coming at you and not feel any anxiety. Like, I would really want you to feel anxiety in that situation. So that would be level one, where if there's a threat, you can recognize it, get anxious, and then that gives you the energy to jump out of the way and do that really quickly. Then so we'd say that's like 30% anxiety out of 100. Then there's level 50, where you're like 50% anxious, which would look like you are still doing all the things that really matter to you, but you have a lot of negative thoughts like, oh, I suck at this, or I really embarrassed myself at school today and everyone is laughing at me and everyone hates me, but you're still going to school. There's no question about that. With those cases, we would probably just use pretty basic cognitive behavioral therapy, which in a nutshell means that we're helping the kid identify how their brain is throwing these negative thoughts at them and then asking them to challenge those thoughts. So putting them on trial. What evidence do you have that everyone hates you? What evidence do you have that some people don't hate you? Try to argue both sides and see if we can get a little bit of flexibility there and see, oh, anxiety is the one saying everyone hates me, but actually I have a lot of evidence that some people don't hate me. And we'd also approach the behavioral piece. So just making sure that that kid isn't holding back in any way that would be meaningful to them and trying to encourage them to keep pushing their boundaries. I'd say the 75% is kids that are engaging in some school refusal. Maybe they haven't gone for a few days. Maybe they're totally socially isolated. Maybe when they go home, they're playing video games for 7 hours at a time or staying up too late playing them. In those cases, we would approach it with that more structured behavioral plan. So removing this like constant reward system and free range, you get whatever you want, you eat whatever you want all the time, pull that all back. Sometimes that means turning the internet off at certain times of day or limiting the apps that kids can go on their phones. And we build in a reward system to try to basically give them a behavioral reset. And then the hope is that they can start to see that that's actually helping them feel better and then build self-efficacy and build motivation to keep kind of building on that as they approach down to the 50%. And then 100%, I don't know what 100% would look like because I think that no one could really sustain 100% for long. But when we get up to the high 90s, we'd be looking at things like self-harm and suicidal ideation. And in that case, we would probably consider a partial hospital program, which means 2 weeks, 8 to 5 or 8 to 4, where they're going and learning a ton of skills very quickly to try to help them get down to a 75 so that they can be safely at home. And if that's not enough, then we'd consider hospitalization, an inpatient level of care, which typically lasts anywhere from a couple days to a week or two. And then you would move them back down that ladder.
Okay, so I am aware. I'm aware of how sometimes situation where someone's experiencing anxiety at a deep level, and the next thing you know, they're being put on anti-anxiety medication. Now,
Oh, yeah.
I happen to not be an advocate of that. I will tell you ahead of time, but I want your thoughts on that. And sometimes it seems like nobody knows what the real cause of this anxiety is, and yet it's there and it's constantly manifesting itself. And so, yeah, either they go to the talk therapy, which as you and I know doesn't work, or they literally get put on medication. Can you share your thoughts on that, if you dare?
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah, I think there are two main themes that come to mind with that question. One is that I think that in the initial intake session, a huge opportunity is missed by most clinicians and in most clinics. So our clinic is actually extremely rare in that we require clinicians to go through a full diagnostic interview or assessment for the first 1 to 3 sessions. So it could take up to 3 hours where we're going through with the child, sometimes with the parent, sometimes not, depending on their maturity level, or the teen or the adult. We're going through and assessing them for everything from depression to social anxiety to panic to agoraphobia to psychosis, bipolar, etc., personality disorders, because we believe and we know that there are very different treatments for each of these things. And oftentimes, especially when a kid or teen comes in, they say, I don't know, I just feel anxious all the time. And it's really hard for them to verbalize what that root cause is or what's happening. So this diagnostic assessment allows us to drill down and give them the language and verbiage to say, like, yes, it's that, no, it's not that. And then we can have a targeted treatment plan. So I'd say that's like the first level of failure in most clinical settings, is not doing a diagnostic assessment, which is mind-blowing to me, but something that I learned at McLean as extremely valuable and important. So I'd say it would be really silly to prescribe someone medication if you don't even know what anxiety disorder they have. Just saying I have anxiety means that they're reacting to something in their environment as threatening when it isn't. Okay, so we're going to reduce your reactivity to that. How is that helpful? Because what we're trying to do in treatment is help someone feel anxious and keep going with what they're doing anyways, and not let that emotion run the show or drive the bus. So actually, a couple of thoughts on medication. I usually say to patients, let's try this out for 3 months first, and then explore medication if it's not working, because it takes 2 or 3 months for CBT to really hit its full effect. And why wouldn't you try, unless you're in a life-threatening, dangerous level of, symptoms, why wouldn't we try this first, just to see how far we can get just from working on your thoughts and your behaviors? Sometimes people come in on tons of medications because they've gone to treatment for years and keep getting added medications each time there's a new Band-Aid needed, but then suddenly they don't even know what's a side effect and what's a symptom. So oftentimes we'll work with kids and teens and adults with a new med provider to kind of titrate them off. And together we'll be checking, is this helping or harming? And adding skills in as necessary to help them do that titration so that they can hopefully live a life with less medications and side effects due to that behavioral work they've done. Lastly, I'd say that oftentimes people come in on a lot of anti-anxiety medications, but my work with people is usually about approaching anxiety and feeling it, like I've said. So having that medication that's really dulling that anxiety is going to prevent them from doing the full amount of work that they could do with exposure therapy. So what we'll usually say is, okay, let's use these meds to help you approach this work, because if your mind is like totally full of anxiety and this makes it like 80% full, at least we can use that 20% to start doing the work. And then once you've got the skills down, let's start seeing what happens if we reduce the meds so that you can feel more anxiety, approach it, and then maybe not need the medication after all. But again, I would always do that paired with a psychiatrist or an NP that I really trust.
Well, and you, one of the key words you said was diagnosis. And it's fascinating to me, as you may or may not be aware, I had a dental practice for 21 years. And during that time, I got very involved in treating chronic pain of the head and neck. And of course, dentists immediately said, oh, it's the TMJ. And so patients would come into me and say, hey, Dr. Branson, I've got TMJ. And I'd go, no, you have two. You've got one on this side and one on this side. So what's your problem? And that, well, I'm getting headaches or I'm getting jaw aches or whatever. And all of a sudden, then taking them through a whole diagnostic procedure to determine what is the root cause of this. And in most cases, it never had anything to do with the TMJ. And
Mm-hmm.
and it seems to me that so often we forget to do that. We forget to get to the root cause of what's causing that anxiety. Um, do you have any examples where you literally were able, without, without getting beyond the HIPAA laws, but do you have any examples of patients that you worked with where literally being able to get in that diagnostic procedure to find the root cause made such a difference in their lives and in the treatment?
Yeah, I can actually combine a few cases to be a really de-identified case, because this has happened time and time again. It's very common in our clinic for someone to come in and say, all right, like I've been in therapy for a decade or 5 years or 3 years, and I've really been working on the fact that I feel like I'm a terrible person deep down. And they'll start crying and they'll be sobbing, saying, I feel so bad that I'm such a terrible person. And oftentimes they found us because they think they might have OCD, but in these cases, it's often a referral from a provider. But if we do the diagnostic assessment that we use, we find that, oh, this person has been going to a therapist saying, oh, I think I'm a terrible person. I'm wishing that my friends would fail their tests, or I'm thinking I'm wishing that, or I'm thinking I might worship the devil. And their therapist for years has been saying, like, no, you don't worship the devil. You are church, attending and abiding citizen. You love God. Like, you're a good person. You're a good person. You're a good person. But it's not a typical question. It's an OCD question. So in that case, we'd actually do the exact opposite for the treatment. So with OCD, we would do exposure therapy, which means we say the very thoughts that feel so scary, and we approach them and we lean into them, because it's the thinking the thought that's scary. It's not that the person actually thinks they're a bad person, because remember, that person was sobbing in session saying, I feel so bad about being a terrible person. Well, that kind of negates the whole thing, right? If you felt bad about it, you wouldn't be a terrible person. So with OCD, we'd say, oh, we might write scripts and practice saying out loud, I'm a terrible person. I might worship the devil. And they get better because it's not actually a real question. It's an OCD question. And when the person was just going to the therapist saying, this is my worry, and the therapist said it's going to be okay, they actually just got worse, because then they were really reliant on the therapist every week to tell them it's going to be okay. Versus we could say, oh, we did this assessment and we found that it's OCD and we can treat it in 2 months, as opposed to 5 to 10 years of therapy.
Well, and I remember as I was doing some coaching with some people on a identity profile, personality type of stuff, and oftentimes I did a little bit of NLP work, and I found that as you get back into a certain situation, oftentimes the very behavior that we're seeing exhibit is based on the fact that they feel like they're no good, they don't have value, and going back there and identifying many times something in their childhood. They were at school and a teacher said something, sometimes inadvertently, sometimes actually they intended to do it, but causing that child, based on their perception, to suddenly feel like they don't have any worth. And that seems to be the thing that has caused a lot of the problems in their lives. Do you find that you can go back to childhood sometimes and discover elements that actually are the causation to a certain degree for the anxiety?
Yeah, I think you bring up actually another really common example of misdiagnosis and how it can just be so life-changing. So it's extremely common for people to come to therapy saying, I have anxiety and depression, or I'm diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And then we'll do the assessment and we'll see that, yeah, they have anxiety symptoms and depression symptoms. They don't have bipolar symptoms. They've never had a manic episode. But we also did an assessment on borderline personality disorder and found that they meet criteria for that 100%. And that's a very common misdiagnosis, where if someone isn't aware of doing the full evaluation, they just say, oh, this patient has anxiety, depression, and mood swings, and then often diagnoses them as bipolar, when it turns out that they have borderline personality disorder, which means that the main theories, the leading theories are that the kid was born and maybe they have big emotions. Maybe they're prone to be more anxious or sad than most kids. And then the family has reacted, or the environment has reacted in a way that has silenced those. So saying like, oh, get over it, or you're overreacting. And they're not doing the validation piece, which then causes the kid to amp up the emotions to kind of finally be heard. So that suddenly the kid is screaming, saying like, I'm not okay. And the family's like, whoa, now you're really overreacting. But like, how do we change this crisis? And like, what do you need us to do? And so then it creates this cycle where the person is having these big mood swings that could happen within an hour. And it's so incredibly treatable, which is sad. But the family goes on thinking that there's just something wrong with this person in our family. So we can often trace, especially cases like that, back to childhood dynamics that were invalidating and led to this pattern of behaviors that eventually really gets in the way for adults.
So when you get back to those instances, what do you do about them? When you can actually go back and identify that, how do you handle that?
Yeah, so I think just naming it and validation is so important as the first stage. Like, oh, wow, I can't imagine what it would have felt like to be expressing those needs and have your parents, the people you should trust most, shut you down and silence you or say you're overreacting. So of course you would try to be louder next time. And then how awful is it that then they try to make you feel like the crazy one? So that validation piece is huge. And then if we can do any sort of like, if it's with adults, compassion generating for why their parents were the way they were, where that training came from, where they learned it from. So to sort of depersonalize it from the person. It wasn't that you were broken. It's that you were you and your parents had these skills and they didn't have other skills and they did the best they could. But what they did wasn't good enough. So you're kind of holding both sides of that dialectic. Like, it wasn't great, it could have been better, and they did the best they could. That's a key tenet of dialectical behavior therapy. So I think that validation piece and then trying to build compassion for the parent can kind of depersonalize it from the person having to hold on to it as a personal attack.
Well, this is really great information. And I imagine some of the people listening today are going, wow, I wish I lived in Western New York. Because there aren't a lot of clinics. Are there a lot of clinics throughout the United States that are as deeply involved and qualified the way you guys are?
I'd say outside of hospital systems, they're not common.
Wow.
Yeah.
So
it's really, I think, because, yeah, go ahead.
What do they do?
I mean, I think there are a lot of individuals that have trained in really great settings that go out into solo private practice, and they're excellent, but I think it's hard to take on a certain level of severity in cases because you're alone. So what we're trying to do is really meet the need and do it in a big group so that we can support each other and then maintain our affiliations with hospitals like McLean and University of Rochester to kind of help us do that hard work, and also to stay engaged in the research and the literature. We really prioritize bringing clinicians on that want to have that evidence-based focus.
Are you able to do this online with the pandemic?
Yeah, we've been doing great online, actually. It's so fascinating because in some ways it's been way better because people get to do the things that they've been avoiding in their house with our help. So for some kids, it's brushing their teeth. And we would sit in session in the office and be like, all right, do you promise to brush your teeth this week? And they'd say yes. And then maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But in this, using the video, we can just say, let's do it right now. What emotions are coming up? What thoughts? What's blocking you? Let's figure it out and get into it. And then try to do it together. And so we're actually seeing a lot of headway because of the video in home.
So does that mean that if I needed some help, I could actually go online and reach you guys and get some help from you guys, even though you're way back east?
Well, the sad thing is there are these state line issues. So I'd have to look into what state the person's calling from and if we're allowed to work with them during COVID. Because the good thing is that right now COVID's making some of the laws like on pause, but typically we're not allowed to practice across state lines. However, COVID is sort of creating this exceptional time where it might be accessible for people. But if they are calling from a different state, and we can use our resources and our relationships to try to find them someone that we would trust in their state, we will absolutely help them do that. There are a lot of good websites that we know about and communities that we can tap into.
So rather than trying to list a whole bunch of things that they need to interview their potential clinician about, you literally can do some of the homework yourselves and find someone within that area, within that state, to help them. That's
Exactly.
wonderful. How do they get a hold of you, Lauren?
Yeah, so they can just Google Genesee Valley Psychology and we'll pop right up. They could also just Google my name. But either way, they can contact us through any of those websites that show up, either my personal one or the clinic's one, and we'll get back to them with suggestions.
All right. Well, we're running out of time, but I know you're writing a book or you're in the process of completing a book, and I'd love to get you back on and talk about that because I think it's a whole different area, isn't it?
It is a whole different area, yes. But I'd love to do that.
Just as a hint, what's the area about?
So the premise of the book is that we know diversity is important in to create better teams, like diversity across gender, sexual orientation, and race. And we're trying to help people create more sustainably diverse teams.
Oh, that's great. Well, listen, Lauren, thank you so much for being on the show. Dr. Lauren Wadsworth. And folks, thank you for joining us today. I hope this was enjoyable for you. As you saw me waving just last minute, I'm sitting in my office and I saw one of my neighbors walking up the street. He was going to ring the doorbell and it's like, no, you can't do that. So I apologize for that.
I thought I was saying something wrong.
But anyway, folks, thanks for listening. I hope this has been of value to you. Look forward to having you join us again. And once again, Lauren, thank you so much for being a part of the show.
Thanks for having me and for the great conversation.
You bet. And folks, we hope that you enjoyed it. Please join us again.